While most religions preach hell, or at least parts of the afterlife that aren't heaven, there aren't many belief systems where you can reasonably expect to find yourself lost there by accident before your death. It's not as though you can unexpectedly trip and fall into the fire, as there's almost always a reason you wind up there, and not a good one at that. In most mythologies, there's a path, an entrance, and some kind of keeper of hell. Earn passage past all of them though, and unfortunately you have made it. In Greek myth, for example, if you know where an entrance to the underworld is, you can simply go there. But unless your time among the living is actually up, you'll have trouble getting in. You won't be able to get past the various chthonic inhabitants and forces which all strive to stop the dead from escaping. Religious belief and theology aside, however, we can say that the gates of hell do really exist in the real world, because there are multiple locations across the world map all claiming to be them. Usually these claims are based on either stories about certain places or just because they look particularly hellish. The Darvaza gas crater in Turkmenistan, for example, is nicknamed the Gates of Hell because it's a giant desolate crater that's been on fire since the 1970s. So it's not exactly a welcoming vista. The real-life gates often match with volcanoes too, for fairly obvious reasons. One of Earth's most infamous volcanoes, Mount Etna in Sicily off the coast of southern Italy, has a long history of being branded a portal to hell. The fire and brimstone are key then, but so's the idea that you must descend into hell. While heaven is typically painted in the clouds, hell reaches deep into earth and stone. The under of the underworld is always crucial. In Greek mythology, perilous descents actually form a genre of fable in their own right, called katabasis, which literally means to go down or descend. One famous katabasis is the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, where Orpheus, grief-stricken over his wife Eurydice's death, descends to the underworld and charms Hades to let him take her back to the surface. The catch is that for as long as the journey back takes, Orpheus mustn't look back at his beloved. Tragically, he does look back, and Eurydice's ghost is lost forever. Stories like this are particularly prevalent in Greek myth, appearing in influential epics like Homer's Odyssey. But they cross over into many other systems and cultures too. Even Jesus is said to have visited hell during the 3 days between his crucifixion and resurrection. But perhaps the most famous descent story of all isn't a Greek myth, but Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy is a medieval epic poem which follows Dante as he gets lost in the woods and finds himself descending deep into the earth. He encounters the Roman poet Virgil, who himself also wrote an iconic descent story in the Aeneid. Virgil then becomes Dante's guide through a version of the afterlife that draws mostly from Christian tradition, but with Greek influences too. The first and most famous part of the Divine Comedy is Inferno, where Dante travels through the 9 circles of hell itself, witnessing the tortures that await those who have committed various sins throughout their life. The circles descend in severity from the first at the top, Limbo, where pagans are punished simply by refusal into heaven, all the way to the tundra of the 9th circle, Treachery, where sinners are frozen in a vast lake for eternity. Other versions of hell feature similar grades too, such as with Jahannam in Islam, which is also split into levels, above which, it's said, there's a bridge that sinners are destined to fall from, quite literally, into hell. For Hindus, Buddhists, and with many other Eastern religions, there's Naraka, another unenviable place composed of many realms where you'll be, amongst other things, burned and tortured. One difference with Naraka compared to most other concepts of hell, however, is that being cast there isn't necessarily an eternal fate. Instead, it's where you go to suffer the consequences of your actions until you've been punished enough, at which point it's possible that you'll be reincarnated. Finally, even back in the ancient Greek underworld, where all souls wound up, the tiered system persists, with the regions Tartarus, Asphodel, and Elysium, roughly translating as hell, purgatory, and heaven, respectively. There are further subsections to the Greek afterlife too, like the Mourning Fields, a place for those who suffered unrequited love in life, and the Isles of the Blessed, a place for the most exceptional errants into Elysium. But back to Dante, who is definitely experiencing a predominantly Christian hell. That's clear enough from the fact that Virgil, his guide, is unable to reach paradise because he's a pagan and not a Christian soul. Regardless, Dante and Virgil encounter lots of demons on their epic journey, and they even pass through a literal gate of hell at the beginning, which is famously inscribed with the words, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." So if you were to fall through the same gates, you could expect a similarly pessimistic sentiment. Luckily for Dante, though, since he isn't actually dead yet, he isn't stuck in the inferno forevermore. Instead, Dante and Virgil venture through the 9 circles and eventually ascend a mountain back to purgatory. For the third and final part of the Divine Comedy, Dante is allowed into paradise, where, having left Virgil behind, he's guided by Beatrice instead. In paradise, he meets angels and saints, and eventually God, who bestows upon him a deep understanding of life and the afterlife. Say you had this understanding, though, and you took it back to Earth. It could be a double-edged sword, seeing as mortals aren't usually permitted to know the secrets of what happens after you die. In some versions of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, for example, Orpheus himself is smote by Zeus because he knows too much. But that is Dante's fate. He doesn't need faith in the afterlife anymore because he's seen it. If you somehow fell through the gates of hell, somehow survived, and went the way of Dante, then it bodes fairly well for you. Since most iterations of hell are presented as one part of a fair and just afterlife, it would be unfair and unjust for you to be damned there ahead of your time, especially if you had done your best to live a moral life in the mortal world. In the same tradition as Dante, Virgil, and various mythological heroes and religious figures of old, you'd perhaps be treated, in the loosest sense of the word, to a guided tour of hell and its many regions and demons. And maybe you'd even be permitted into heaven too for a quick look around. But then it would be back to the daily grind of life on Earth, only now you'd have enlightenment. If you were to go more the way of Orpheus, then not only would your experience in hell irreversibly ruin the rest of your life, but you might not be permitted to live for long back on this mortal plane anyway. With such incredible knowledge inside your head, you'd be an unwelcome link between here and the great beyond, prone to spilling all the secrets of hell whenever anybody asked for them. Death could come quickly for you then, even though you will have already survived hell once before. Or perhaps an even worse fate would await you on Earth, because you'd be driven mad by fear of the eternal torments that you and only you have already witnessed. Such knowledge of the divine machinations behind life and death could simply prove too much for humans to understand. Of course, if you ended up in hell because you actually died rather than by some infernal fluke, then there's pretty much zero chance of you being so fortunate as to get away easy. Depending on which version of the afterlife you subscribe to, or which you ultimately encountered, you're either going to be tortured for a long time or forever. The best you could hope for is to be doomed to roam listlessly as a lost soul in some version of limbo. Otherwise, you're in for pain, misery, loneliness, or being boiled alive in a river of flaming blood for all eternity. Nobody's about to prove that hell in the afterlife truly exists, but as a concept, it offers plenty of possibilities, without much by way of an enviable outcome. Get lucky, and you get a tour of the underworld, like Dante. Get unlucky, and you endure many lifetimes of merciless suffering. And that's what would happen if you